Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. It seems to me that one of the most important questions we can ask today in our era of multiple regional, local, and global crises is how come this doesn't change? Why is it that when we read the news, we see the same scandals, the same stupidities, the same power plays, ecological destruction, warfare, political corruption, religious corruption, financial corruption, you name it? It just goes on, year after year, decade after decade. And we even when it's not big and showy like that, a lot of us have noticed that we embark on different kinds of programs for, let's say, personal transformation. How do you do relationships better? How do you date more successfully? How do you become a different person or whatever it is? And we do these in good faith. We often pay a great deal of money for them. And we go through all of it, and it may make some minor improvements here and there. We like ourselves a little better. We're a little less hard on ourselves. We've got maybe a new contemplative practice to do. But for the most part, fundamental change escapes us. Why is that? So I want to look at that in this podcast. And I'm coming at this from the standpoint of someone who's always been interested in deep change and has taught and written to that for 2 decades now. So I have a pretty good sense of when change is lasting, deep, and serious, and when it's shallow, surface, and temporary. So I wanted to reflect on that a little bit and think out loud with you about a class I'm putting together on getting to the really deep kind of change and what that might look like. I'm trying to pull together interests, and I have a lot of them, from different classes I've taught, lectures I've given. If I can bring all these together into one simple offering that people will actually find worthwhile, what might that look like? So one answer is a class, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. But that question is so important. And there's a number of factors that we can identify up front, but I think they're fairly surface. So for instance, I live in California, where public transportation for the most part is awful. We all drive cars, or a lot of us do anyway. It depends on where you live in California. Year after year, we sit in traffic, or sometimes we have subways when there's any built at all. I used to take BART a lot, and the thing was constantly breaking down, late, there was crime on it, you name it. So I've been in California all my life, and there's so much that hasn't changed. The pathetic public transportation, the massive traffic, the boxy houses and suburbs springing up all over the place, eating what's left of the land that's here. And so we can point to all that and say, well, this is all funded, right? There's powerful people with lots of money and influence who benefit from this situation. And that's true. No question about it. One case in point is Los Angeles, where at one time in the early 1900s, there was a really great trolley system, electric. And then people who decided that Angelenos should drive cars and be in buses instead came and dismantled the whole thing so they could make their bus systems and their auto sales profitable. And we're still suffering from the effects of that. So that's one answer, fairly surface. Somebody's paying for it. Somebody's benefiting. Goes into the category of why we can't have nice things, right? There's this planet, by the way, in Star Trek that our culture often reminds me of. It's called Ferenginar, and it's the planet of greed. And so on Ferenginar, you can't do anything without paying money. Usually a lot of it. So you walk through a door, there's a slot where you have to put coins in. You ask for help, you have to pay the person, right? It's like capitalism run crazy. All the politicians are bought and paid for. Sound familiar? So that's one reason things don't change. Another is the pathetic politics we have going on, not just in this country, but other ones as well. Really incredible bald-faced lies being told out in public now. Used to be somewhat subtler, but that's a factor. And we know all this, I think. So if we go a little bit deeper, then we start coming to something that comes up as a theme over and over and over again. And it's actually mentioned so often that it's acquired its own kind of imaginal presence. And I use the word imaginal on purpose because the phrase is lack of imagination. The 911 Commission took a retrospective look at the lack of preparedness for the 911 disaster here in the States. And that's what they said, lack of imagination. That's the one of the underlying causes for all this, right? And the thing about imagination is it's not just a skill. It's not just a kind of additional capability of consciousness. Pretty much all we do, all we plan for, all we think and feel depends on the quality of our imagination. One of the uses that it has, and evolutionary biologists talk about this sometimes, is that when you can imagine some consequences to an action you're about to take, you don't have to actually do it and find out that way. Imagination is at the core of empathy, of understanding each other and how we feel about things, and understanding the consequences of our own actions, whether that's personally or collective. Imagination is the way that we envision possible futures that are more desirable than the world we're living in right now. And just about anything you can think of that humanity has ever achieved, attained, created, whatever it is, built, it all begins as some kind of a fantasy. Somebody's saying, wouldn't it be cool if there was this? And then other people resonate with the fantasy, and then it actually gets turned into reality. Imagination has also been relied on as a spiritual path. I'm doing some PhD work on this right now, and I'm talking about ancient Egyptian religion, and then Hermeticism, Gnosticism, other kinds of esoteric approaches, practices that come out of that. The Romantic poets in Europe, depth psychology, especially Jung's variety of this, many others. So that's imagination as a form of gnosis, direct apprehension of reality, direct intuitive knowing. I also refer to it as imaginowing. When imagination goes wrong, then we have mental illness, warfare, crime, pollution, you name it. Many of what are called design problems or design flaws are directly attributable to a lack of imagination. Let's see, let's set up a student loan system, which is not a bad idea. But let's do it with lenders who can charge twice the interest that anybody else is charging once you have the loan. So if the people in government who oversee all this had engaged their imagination, one scenario that might have come up is what happens when graduates in debt aren't making enough money to fully pay the loan payments off? And what happens when they take forbearances and then the interest builds and the interest builds, and pretty soon there's no affordable amount by which you can ever pay the loan off, ever. What happens if you privatize the electrical utilities of an entire state and remove all of their operation from public oversight? Not too hard to predict. What happens when you make email sending anonymous? Do you think there might be a chance that all the abusive or psychopathic people who want to abuse others just might take advantage of that? Dr. Frankenstein has often been described as the original mad scientist, but I would argue that he actually wasn't a mad scientist. If you read that novel carefully, what you find is a scientist who never asks himself what could go wrong. That's his problem. And so here he is, an idealist, trying to do something to improve the lot of humanity. But he's also got a head and a heart full of aggressive impulses that he's never come to terms with. So what happens? They all get expressed in his experiment, which wreaks havoc on him and everybody else it comes in contact with. So if we want things to change in our families, in our consciousness, in our political institutions, in education, whatever it is, then we absolutely have to realize the crucial role that imagination plays in making things change. Imagination provides the lore in our guiding stories. And what I mean by lore is the underlying assumptions, the traditions handed down, the practices handed down, the underlying themes, myths, archetypes, images, whatever you want to call it, that are fuel for the stories we navigate by, the keystone stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what group. So I think I've pretty much already dealt with through my anecdote at the beginning. And those stories in turn drive what we do, how we show up, what our actions and planning are, and therefore what the outcomes are. And this is something that I've faced over and over in many different arenas and areas of experience, whether it's growing up in California, the supposed land of promise where nothing ever really changes, to growing up in a chaotic family, being a psychotherapist for a while, being an undergraduate and a graduate educator, working in the world of business, working as a consultant, and other things too, where over and over I see this intervention here, this new way of doing things, this reform goes nowhere. But these things over here seem to make a difference. Why is that? What's the formula? And again, I come back to, among other things, imagination. And this is reflected really in the work that I've been doing. I didn't do psychotherapy just to fix people or supposedly cure people, but part of my interest in depth psychology was that I was interested in what's underneath the symptom, what's underneath the conflict. Is there a message there? Is the psyche trying to tell us something? So when I came across family systems and got trained in it, one of the things I liked about it was that family systems assumes that when a family is going haywire, that there's something about the underlying structure that's off. And if you can address that, you can make real change. And so that was helpful. Learning Jungian and depth psychology was helpful, teaching it, of course. But I noticed that most of the things that have been fascinations of mine have had that underlying assumption that we need to imagine differently. So I coined the word enchantivism to talk about stories and performances and practices that come perhaps out of situations of injustice or conflict, usually at the social level, but that dream us onward and show us what we could be like and how things could go right. That it's not enough to just say what's wrong. We have to have visions together of where we want to be and of what's working right now. For the same reason, instead of revolution, which tends to rotate the same kinds of people back into leadership positions, I talk about trans-revolution. What are the cultural changes that we've seen, whether they're completed or in progress, that really involve some kind of deep structural transmutation that's successful? And don't we need to study more of those and find out what they're about? Lorology is what I call the how of all this, looking at our keystone stories, thinking about the kinds of stories we want to use to guide us, feeling into that, imagining into that. The fiction I write, there's this outfit that I was going to say I dreamed up, but I think maybe it dreamed itself up. It's called the Dream Veil Exchange. And I think I'm going to do a podcast just on that. But it's fictional. It has to do with this institute where groups of people talk to fictional characters. Mycroft Holmes, let's say, or Huck Finn or whoever. And we know from Carl Jung's work that sometimes the figures talk back if we imagine into them deeply enough. And amazing things happen. All kinds of wisdoms and insights come out of that. So why not set up something to do that more systematically? We could talk about the archetypes, not just the family systems, but the archetypes that permeate our families. In other words, the patterns that recur over and over down the generations. In my families, lots of fire on one side, water on the other, to name a simple example. What about our dream life? Not just interpreting our dreams, but world dreams where the whole world shows up or some aspect of it. And then it's not just about us, it's the way in which some aspect of Earth, nature, the elements, whatever it is, speaks to us, calls out to us. And how can we respond to that? And then there's the presence of place, parapsychology, which has generated all kinds of qualitative and theoretical research for about 20 years now. How places show up in us, how we're always in their style of discourse. And a lot of us have an intuitive sense of this. We go up on mountaintops to have a higher view of things. We're near rivers when we want to be more in the flow of things. Go to deserts for purification. But there's more complex examples too. So all of these and other areas that I've been interested in all assume that imagining in a deeper way, a clearer way, makes real change happen in the world and in ourselves as well simultaneously. It's not just the tired old linear formula, old causal formula of you got to change yourself first and then the world will change, or the other way around. They happen together. We can't change if our relationships don't change, and vice versa, for instance. And our values need to change, our goals need to be updated, things like that. So for this class I'm dreaming up, and I really want to know if you're interested in taking it, it would be a paid offering. The cost would depend on how many people show up. I like to do things low fee, and I also have to make a living. So I do offer a lot of things for free, tons of YouTube material, this podcast, all kinds of other things. The classes I would charge a bit for, and the key word is restoring, which of course sounds a bit like restoring as well, because I have my eye on how can we achieve states of renewal, new stories or different kinds of old stories, different tellings of old stories that can move us forward toward the sorts of futures that we really want to be in, individually and collectively. And so all the topics that I just mentioned that have been part of my work over the years, all of that would be included in the class. And right now I'm thinking maybe twice a month, maybe second and fourth Fridays, Saturdays, I'm not sure yet. You can let me know what you think. So we could have a couple of weeks on imagine knowing and developing the power of imagination and seeing its relationship to creativity and innovation in different settings. There's always going to be a practical component to this, just as there is when I teach. We could do a couple of weeks or longer, depending on where the class wants to go, on personal myth and what does that mean? What's the story behind the story that we think of as our biography? We could look at archetypal family systems. We could look at parapsychology and reconnecting with the presence of the places where we live. All kinds of things. How do we deal with what's being called eco-anxiety? We could look at that. I want these classes to be not only useful and challenging, but deep. And I'm thinking of the alchemical word transmutation, which if you look at the etymology, means not only change, but deep change, lasting change. And what are some of the possibilities for scaling up lasting change? And how do we dream it up together and stay networked together? And in the long term, how might we mature as a species? Young pointed out that for the intractable problems of life, they're not so much worked through as outgrown. How can we imagine humanity mature and actually take steps in that direction? Steps that may be difficult, but that are also fun and playful and magical and enchanting. Thank you.